Okay. On behalf of the Wits University alumni here in Israel, Telfair Jerusalem branch, and Pomerantz Bookshop, I'd like to welcome you all this evening on this very cold and rainy evening. And I really appreciate that you've taken the time and effort and braved the real cold to be here. I've just come out of quite a severe flu, and I've got a lot of friends who would have been here, but they in the middle of their flu. But this is something I would never give up, and it's such an honor to be here and to see this evening happen. So I just want to mention this book, The Unfinished Diary, how I became involved in the book. So Khani, who's sitting here, is my nurse, and I'm quite passionate about documenting Holocaust survivors, and I told Khani that I have a passion for it, and she said, well, my father has a greater passion than you. He lives the Holocaust. And she told me that he wrote this book. It's about his father, The Unfinished Diary. And I immediately went to Mea Shearim, because I came first to Pomerantz and I saw it wasn't here. I searched all over and it just wasn't here. So I went to Mea Shearim and I bought the book. And I started reading, and I couldn't put it down. Every page was a masterpiece. There are no words to describe how authentic, in real time, you actually feel that you're in Poland. And since we're in Poland, my wife and I went there about a year and a half ago. We really felt that I was living that trip, being in Poland. So I immediately came to the store here, which I've been many times, and they know me quite well. And I said, you have to have the book in the store. How can Pomerantz not have this book? So I started opening the book, and I showed, I don't know if it was Nachum, but I showed who wrote in the book. And when you actually go to the introduction, you'll see quite a few historians, very prominent Holocaust historians, who write their impressions on the book. And one of these historians is Alan Rosen. And when I met Feivel, when he was here for a bar mitzvah, Khani, I think it was for your son's bar mitzvah. So in 93 Beit Vegan, I live in Uziel, which is very close. Feivel, the moment we met, we just connected beautifully. And then Feivel said, he'd like me to meet Alan Rosen. And he lives in the same building. And he came up and we met. And it was unbelievable that in the same building, what a coincidence. It's not more than a coincidence, just min hashamayim. So I told the sons here, Michael's sons, about Alan Rosen, who lives in the same building as Feivel Wolgeler. And then they said to me, but that's our father's chevrusa. Not only is Alan Rosen their father's chevrusa, they grew up in the same town, they were in the same class. So this book it's meant to be in the shop. A lot of people have come and they bought it, and it actually changes your life when you read it, because I think it is the most amazing book on the Shoah. I mean, I've read many books on the Shoah, but I've never ever read a book like this. So tonight we are very privileged to have the author, well, somebody who was in Poland, who was born in Poland, who lives in Zurich, and was here for a simcha. And I'm so glad that you gave the precious time. I think you're leaving tomorrow back to Zurich, to address us tonight. It's a great zchut to be here. And without further ado, Feivel, if you can explain the journey and how you came about publishing the book, The Unfinished Diary, A Chronicle of Tears. Thank you.
Thank you, Les, and thank you, family Pomerantz, for arranging this event. After my father's memoirs were published, The Unfinished Diary, people tend to ask me to tell them about my family and about the Holocaust. Now, although I was born in Poland in the middle of the war, I'm not quite what people mean when they say a Holocaust survivor. I didn't suffer in the war. I have no painful memories. I was simply too young to understand what was going on, and my mother took very good care of me, and she kept her mental anguish to herself. On the positive side, as far as knowing something about the Holocaust, I grew up among Holocaust survivors. I pestered them with a lot of questions, and I listened carefully to how they survived. And I've been occupying myself with that subject since I grew up. Now, as a sideline, about 1,000 years ago, during the Unholy Crusades, some of our sages maintained that Amalek, the tribe of Amalek, or the people of Amalek, were in Europe. And in fact, the former chief rabbi of Jerusalem, Rabbi Joseph Chaim Sonnenfeld, who passed away in 1932, before the Nazis came to power, he said, I have a tradition that Amalek is Germany, or Germany is Amalek. So let me begin very quickly about the Nazi ideology. The Nazis were all children of Christian parents, most of them. And they got their first anti-Semitism through their mother's milk. However, in order for Jews to escape from that hatred, all they had to do was to convert. Now the Nazis were cleverer than the Christians. They invented racial anti-Semitism, and it wasn't possible to escape from that, because even quarter Jews were doomed according to the Nazis. Nazis wanted to abolish all religions because religion teaches monotheism, ethics and morals, and these three things are completely at odds with the Nazi ideology that only the strongest have the right to survive. So they considered Jews and Judaism as their worst enemies. Of course, there was jealousy. I mean, a high percentage of doctors, lawyers and millionaires in Germany were Jews. So jealousy is parallel to the hatred, to the religious hatred of Christianity. Okay, so Hitler published his book in 1924, but no one took it seriously until 1933, when he came to power. He came to power in democratic elections, and the first thing that the Nazis did was to abolish all democratic institutions. The Jews didn't take him seriously either at first. Most German Jews said a nation that produced Goethe and Beethoven wouldn't do this and wouldn't do that. But those who understood what was going on, they procured visa and emigrated. The Nazis made a lot of laws against Jews, the Nuremberger laws, the racial laws, and the question is, were the Nazis not worried what the world would say about their activities? The world gave them an answer at the Evian conference in July 1938. The general consensus of all attending democratic nations was, we have no Jewish problems and we don't want to import one. After that, the Nazis really began to act, as in the infamous Kristallnacht, November 1938. A few days before the start of World War II, the Nazis signed a treaty with their arch enemy, Communist Russia, to divide Eastern Europe in spheres of influence. This meant that at first about 4 million Jews were under the German dominion. Later on, when Germany attacked Russia in spite of the treaty, 6 million Jews in all Baltic states, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, 6 million Jews were under the government of Nazis. A funny thing, the Nazis and the communists wanted to abolish all religions. The Nazis, because the religions contradict paganism, and the communists wanted to get rid of religions because they are the causes of conflicts. According to the Nazis, mankind consists of Übermenschen, these are the German Aryans, of Menschen, their slaves, and of Untermenschen, these are the Jews who have no right to exist. The communist view on mankind is that all humans are equal, and how Jews loved to hear that. And no wonder that so many Jews became communists and fled to Russia, and this of course caused the Nazis to equate communism with Judaism. Okay, let's come to the consequences for Polish Jewry. After the quick military victory over Poland, the Nazis started to act. They came from west to east slowly and began to implement what they called the Endlösung, the end solution of the Jewish problem. They did it with Einsatzgruppen. These were mobile gas vans. They collected the Jews in ghettos. They deported them to concentration camps. These were labor camps and later camps with gas chambers and crematoria, and also a few pure death camps. 1941, Germany attacked Russia, and that was the end of most Eastern European Jews. My hometown was Żarłowszyce. Żarłowszyce is a small city, about 10,000 inhabitants, 45 kilometers northeast of Krakow. It was not a typical shtetl. There were much too many Jews. And many refugees from the west who were fleeing the Nazis came to Żarłowszyce. They were received as well as possible. And when I was born in 1941, life was still bearable. A lavish Sude was offered at my bris. With the refugees came plenty of rumors, and my father's diary begins in 1942, in mid-1942. I talked to a lot of people and came to the conclusion that few things were known, few things were feared, and a few things were unknown. Persecutions and boycotts, this was known. Since the Nürnberger laws with the famous slogans "Kauft nicht bei Juden" or "Die Juden sind unser Unglück," this was known. Expulsions and abductions, yes, also known since Kristallnacht 1938. Were there executions and murders? Yes, this was also known, but not on a grand scale. Did people know about the mobile gas vans? I don't think so. I have a feeling they didn't, because no one ever survived such a van. The people were forced into the back of a lorry, which was hermetically closed. The exhaust gases came into that room, and the people died after 20 minutes. and they were dumped in trenches. Did people know that work camps existed? Yes, this was well known, but there was a delusion that one who went to such a work camp automatically survived, which was not true. I know many people, young people, who volunteered to go to such a camp and survived. Later on, many camps had added crematoria and gas chambers. So, as a wealthy family in Žalošice, we could afford to take many precautions. We prepared, I'm saying we, I mean my parents, my grandparents, my uncles. We prepared hideouts in nearby villages with friendly farmers. We stored merchandise and valuable jewelry with trustworthy Poles. And needless to say, hardly anything was ever given back after the war. And when returning Jews insisted, this caused many pogroms. My father melted 16 kilos of silver and hid it together with jewelry and furs, and it's probably still hidden somewhere in Žalošice. And a very important thing, in defeated Poland, as in any defeated country, the local currency drops in value to almost nothing. So my father got many gold coins, which turned out to be very important for us, and I still have some. He got a pistol, a gun, and learned how to use it. He procured poison and razor blades for the worst case. He got forged identity documents and arische Papieren. These were certificates signed by a friendly priest that the one who has it is not a Jew, is an Aryan. This was okay for Polish-speaking people like my mother and myself. I was blonde and blue-eyed. However, most frum men spoke very bad Polish. However, at least they could cut off their beards and their payas and dress like a goy, not like with a kaftan. One day in late summer 1942, the neighboring restaurant owner told us that 300 meals have been ordered. So we got the news that the Nazis were soon coming to town. They came, but before that, when they came, they ordered all Jews to assemble in the marketplace. My aunt, a younger sister of my mother, and with my sister, my 3-year-old sister, they were supposed to go in hiding together. They had perfect arische Papieren, but somehow they were caught and went to the assembly in the marketplace. From there, the people were deported to the Belzec extermination camp. The rest of us, we went into little hamlets and hid as arranged. At first, the farmers who hid us didn't risk a lot. Later on, when the Germans realized that out of a population of well over 10,000 Yidden, they only deported about 2,000 and killed in trenches in the cemetery about 1,500. They realized that there must be a lot of Jews hiding in the hamlets. And they were helped by Polish youth, Junakes, they were called. What the Polish government now is doing is they're lying. The Poles were very much happy that the Jews were eliminated. this allowed a lot of Poles to take the place of Jews, to rise from a low social status to the status of Yidden, who were middle class. Anyways, my mother, my teenage cousin Esther Ehrlich, and I had very good Arische Papieren. We decided to split from the rest of the group, who were obvious looking like Jews, and to travel to Warsaw, where no one knew us. Traveling by train was punishable by the death penalty. Carrying forged documents also. So we risked a lot, but we arrived safely in Warsaw and were straight away arrested by a Gestapo agent. He took us to the Gestapo headquarters and took my mother and myself into his office and began to interrogate my mother. She stood there and I played on his desk with his pencils, and he told my mother, "I suspect you're a Jew." So my mother said no. He repeated again. I don't know exactly, my mother didn't describe it perfectly, but suddenly he asked her, "Do you want to live?" So my mother understood what he meant, and she said, "Yes, I would like to live." "And would you like to live?" Meaning, how much does it cost? He got a hint. He asked for 1,000 zlotys and told my mother, may you live happily through the war." My mother was convinced until her last days that this was Eliyahu Hanovi, the prophet Elijah. We went back and forth in Judenrein, Warsaw, and my mother told me she felt there was an uprising in the ghetto where all Jews were. There was a struggle. Anyways, wherever we found lodging, the hosts soon understood that we were Jewish, and he either threatened to report us or he asked for more money. It wasn't a good idea to stay in Warsaw. And my mother remembered that a non-Jewish teacher in Jaloshice had said that his old mother in a village called Jedlja near Radom, that she would like to take in refugees for money. So the local priest helped us find this old woman, Mrs. Marta Stepanova. She was the caretaker of a holiday bungalow. The owner was an elderly lady dentist. We stayed there from the end of 1942 until the spring of 1945. The motives of that lady were interesting. First of all, she got 10 times more money from us than her government pension as the widow of an officer in World War I. So that was money. Furthermore, she was frum. She hoped to convert us, and she forced us actually to go to church. I remember such a visit. We had to kneel and my knees hurt because I didn't have a pillow. She tried to enlist my mother in the church choir. She honestly believed in the blood libel. I'm sure you know what that is. And when my mother was outraged, she said, okay, I believe you don't do it, but I'm certain other Jewish sects do it. She said that Jews are being punished because they keep rejecting Jesus. With time, she became kinder and made less anti-Semitic remarks. In a way, she admired Jews. She told my mother, "Your men drink alcohol only on Sabbath and only from little thimbles, whereas our men come home every night stone drunk and beat their wives and children. She admired the Koznitzer Rebbe. I don't know exactly which one it is, but she said the Koznitzer Rabbiner. And she told the following story. This Polish woman told following story. Her father had been a manager in a railway station. And once a shipment arrived for a Jew. This Jew came, picked up the merchandise and didn't sign a receipt. Sometimes later the Jew came and asked for the merchandise. And the manager didn't know what to do. He took the Jew to the Koznitzer Rebbe. And the Koznitzer Rebbe knew this Yidel and gave the manager right. So she admired the Rebbe. However, she complained later. Mrs. Stepanova complained. She told to my mother, "When I told you this story, your eyes shone. But when I tell you stories about the Catholic Bible, you fall asleep." When visitors arrived, my mother had to sit with them and pretend to eat with them. As I said before, the owner was a fine elderly lady, a dentist, and her daughter were good people. They even let me, a Jewish boy, play with their granddaughter. The local priest knew who we were, and he discouraged the conversion efforts. He preached in church, probably in a positive way about Jews. So this is one of the reasons we survived. Mrs. Stepanova urged my mother not to give all the healthy food to me. She said, "After the war, you will need your strength." In the second year, 1944, there was absolutely no Jewish calendar available. So my mother kept Pesach and Yom Kippur one day longer. And I must say, from what my father writes, they tried, I think successfully, to keep kosher, to keep Shabbos and Yom Tov. After the war, my mother corresponded with Mrs. Stepanova, and I have her letters. And my mother sent her packages with clothes and medicines until 1950, when my stepfather stopped it. There are a few things I remember myself. Playing games with my 16-year-old cousin. I collected wood pines and wood in the nearby forest for heating in winter. In winter I played snow. I stayed a lot outdoors, and I grew up healthy and big, robust, unlike most other surviving children. So I can say we were lucky to survive, but this word lucky is relative, because the greater part of my large family was murdered. We have to believe that it was min hashamayim that some of us would survive. But one tends to look for the reasons behind such an accomplishment. So my mother was mentally very strong. She had nerves of steel. We had enough money to pay for all our needs. I looked like a real goy. I began to walk very early, at 10 months. And later on, my mother never had to carry me. And I began to talk very late. And this, after 3.5 years, and this in pure Polish. My earlier babblings in Yiddish was incomprehensible and very unlikely to betray us. Of my father's group of 10 people, 8 were not so lucky. Same as some 3 million other Polish Jews. Only his brother, my uncle David, and my cousin Feivel Wolgeler survived. As far as I'm concerned, there was one constant danger, because little boys are easily identified as Jewish. I remember very distinctly, once I wandered into a German garrison full of soldiers, German soldiers, near Yedlia. I was 3.5 years old. The soldiers were very kind. They called me in, they gave me sweets, and showed me how to take apart and assemble their guns. Fortunately, I did not have to relieve myself. Only after 2 hours and after frantically looking for me did my mother find me. In the spring of 1945, the Germans had already retreated since 1944, with the Russians running after them. I have to add that many Russian officers were Jews. I remember heavy bombardments. Bombs were falling all around us. We spent a lot of nights in trenches, and I saw flashes on the horizon. In the spring of 1945, it was finally safe to officially leave Yedlia. We walked and then hitchhiked in a Russian jeep to Radom. I was allowed to sit on the driver's lap, and I played around with the buttons, and he told me, no, this you can't touch, this you may touch. Very kind people, the Russian soldiers. And I saw many dead Germans along the trenches, along the road. In the Radom marketplace, we saw a large group of soldiers with their hands on their heads, and Russian soldiers guarding them. My mother gives me a big stone and told me, throw it at them. I approached. One of the German soldiers smiles at me, and I didn't throw. A year later, I'm sure I would have thrown. So we made our way back to Jalošice to find out what the other group, what happened. My mother had a bad feeling, because since June 1944 we hadn't gotten any messages anymore from my father's group. So she was prepared for the worst. But in Jalošice we met Uncle David and Feivel Wolgeler, and they told us what happened. That the whole group had been murdered. We went into our apartment. My mother found some foreign currency behind a tile in the kitchen, but of course didn't know where the silver and the jewels were hidden. A woman, a neighbor, tried to convince my mother to stay a bit. You'll find everything. But my mother felt uneasy, and we left. Later on, we heard that the son-in-law of this lady had arranged a pogrom in Jalošice, and 5 Jews were murdered. So we were lucky. We stayed in Gleiwitz for many months, and there I had my first Seder, conducted by Rav Sholem Pinchas Wohlgelernter. A cheder opened just across the street from us, and my mother sent me to the cheder. I was 5 years old almost. I came there without a head covering. After the lesson, when all boys went out, the Rebbe called me and told me, you see these holes in the ceiling? Yes, I saw them. They were shots. You know what these are? I said no. So he said, everything that you learned, that went into your head, flew out of your head through these holes to God in heaven. You know why? Because you have no head covering. Next day I had a head covering. Okay, I remember a few things as a child in Gleiwitz. Really, we wanted to get out of Poland. However, the Soviet communists who were in charge of, who had conquered all Poland, they didn't let anybody out of Poland, out of the people's paradise. That was an unheard of thing, that people wanted to leave the communist paradise. However, as a result of the Kielce pogrom in July 1946, where a Polish mob murdered 45 Jews, the world opinion turned on the communists, and they said to all Jews who wanted, get out. We escaped, so to say, out of Poland in a train on Shabbos. We came to a refugee camp in Diablice near Prague in Czechoslovakia, and then in refugees homes in Strasbourg and Schirmeck, that's in France. There I met other children, a lot of boys, half a head smaller than me, but much, much superior to me. And I didn't understand how come. Little boys who are so much superior to me. Later I heard that they had been hidden, many had been hidden for 3 years underground, hadn't seen fresh air, hadn't gotten any proper food. They stayed small. In Strasbourg I had my first Sukkos with a family that I'm still in touch with. The refugee leaders, they sent out catalogs with pictures of all children with a short story of their lives, and one of these catalogs landed in Pittsburgh, and a doctor in Pittsburgh, Dr. Harry Krüger, adopted me, so to say. He sent me toys and money and clothes, and I'm still in touch with his son Donald and his daughter Marilyn Fröhlich. However, in this refugee place, from sick children I contacted tuberculosis on the lungs, and the best available treatment was in Switzerland. However, the Swiss didn't give any visa. Now, our relative, Rav Sholem Pinchas Wolgeler, who was a UNRWA officer, an American UNRWA officer, that was a United Nations thing, he wrote to Federal Councillor Max Petitpierre in Switzerland to ask for a visa. And this good man, Max Petitpierre, had a bad conscience. He had dealt with Nazi Germany, had bought gold, sold ball bearings to anyways, he straight away sent a visa. I was admitted in 1947 in a clinic in Lesa in the care of the famous Professor Rollier, and cured after 13 months. My mother lived in nearby Montreux. In 1950 she married my unforgettable stepfather, Israel Mordechai Finkelstein. My oldest male grandson, who's here, is called after him. So I grew up among Holocaust survivors. My parents, whenever they met people, the first question was, where were you during the war? How did you survive? In 1951, my stepfather took me to the Frankfurt industrial fair. He was looking for Parnusse. The city was bombed out. There was hardly any building standing, but the fair took place. And whenever we walked, along the booths, and my stepfather would see somebody who would call out, Amchu. If the other person says, Wie bitte? So my stepfather said, I wasn't talking to you. If the other person said, repeated Amchu, then they started talking together. My mother very often spoke about her past. And my stepfather never said anything. Although he had lost a wife and 3 children, he never spoke, he never told us anything. Not even to my brother, who's his biological son. People ask me how I felt about my father. We were separated when I was not yet 2 years old, and I never saw him again. So it was really impossible to develop emotional ties. My mother always wept when speaking about him. She must have adored him, but somehow didn't give me much information. However, I met a lot of people who knew him, family members, studying partners, friends, partisans. They couldn't stop praising him. Some years ago I met here in Jerusalem 2 friends of his, quite well-known people, Arthur and Joseph Tenenbaum, natives of Jaloshice. This is what they told me. He dressed elegantly, walked and spoke nobly. He was a very dignified, learned and kind person. An immense Talmid Chacham, he knew everything. Everybody wanted to associate with him, learn with him and from him. Another man who knew him as a teenager, Alfred Roseneck, told me he was the best, kindest person, a genius in Torah and Derech Eretz. Of course, I was very proud of having had such a father. The funny thing is, when my children speak to me about my stepfather, they say Opa, that means grandpa. When they speak to me about my father, they say your father. So they have no connection to him. My mother, my teachers, my mother always kept telling my teachers who my father was. Everyone who knew him expected me to become somewhat like him, and I always knew I would never make it. He seemed to me to have been from another world. I'm sure I missed not having had a real father, that is, until the age of 10. After that I had a wonderful stepfather. As I said, 2 of my grandsons, one is here, are named after him. People ask me, did I feel or do I feel like a Holocaust survivor? Having had to say Kaddish since I learned to read, it was about age 8 or 9, on my yahrzeit I felt very self-conscious. Having parents and a brother called Finkelstein was a problem. My stepfather wouldn't allow me to change my name. He wanted to keep the Wolgeler line alive. After I met my uncles David and Avrom in Toronto, when I was 12.5 years old, I often dreamed, really dreamed, that my father would also show up. My aunt Reisele and my 3-year-old sister were deported in 1942 by train from Jaloshice to Belzec. I imagined, because I heard such stories, I imagined that my aunt threw my sister out of the train, that peasants picked her up, and that she would somehow come back to us. Do I feel like a child of Holocaust survivors? I don't know how one is supposed to feel, but I'm sure I do. My mother often spoke about the Holocaust to me and to my children. The question is, did this affect them? It must have. A good example is my son Nafti, who was born in 1970 and who knows more about this book and about the story of the diary more than me, more than anybody else. How do I feel about the civilized world for abandoning the Jews? Many countries had enough space to absorb 1 million of Jews, but refused. During the war, the Allies were certainly glad that Germany was investing so much time and effort in pursuing the Jews, because this weakened the German war effort. I actually heard once in Johannesburg following: had South Africa, with a population of 10 million people in 1939, had they taken 1 or 2 million Jews in, the whites would have kept the majority and not lost control of the country. That's what I heard from competent people. The Allies could easily have stopped the mass murder of Hungarian Jews in 1944 by bombing the railway tracks to Auschwitz and the crematoria, but they didn't do it. I suspect that many Christians in Europe, as well as in America, did not mind too much that the Jewish population was being decimated in Europe. The proof is today's European anti-Semitism. Now, the Christians never wanted to wipe out the Jews. Their theory is that there must always be Jews in the world to prove that the Christian religion is superior and that the Jews are, but they never wanted to completely kill. The Nazis wanted that. After the Holocaust, Jews hoped that anti-Semitism was finally overcome, and what a delusion this is. Anti-Semitism is alive and well. And nowadays, Europeans and others feel free to practice anti-Semitism in the form of anti-Israel activities, which is almost always pure anti-Semitism. Okay. If you have any questions, but I'm not finished yet.
No?
I come now in details of the diary, how the diary survived. Already as a youngster, my father was a gifted writer. His Rebbe, the Ostrovzer Rebbe, authorized him to write down his lectures. He corresponded with Gedolim. And I have the copy of a postcard, it's in the book, with the questions he wrote to the Rogatchover Gaon. I'll tell you quickly how this happened. This young man, my grandson Sruli, was once invited to a bris, and he was called up for some kind of kibbut. He was called Yisroel Mordechai Wolgeler, mechibet me with this and that. After that, someone came to him and said, "Are you the son of Wolgeler, who published, of Chaim Yitzchak Wolgeler?" He said, "Yes, that's my father." So the man told him, "No, I mean someone who died in the war." So he said, "That's my great-grandfather." This man told him that Yeshiva University has got a postcard that my father wrote to the Rogatchover Gaon. He got in touch with a Mrs. Berger there, and she scanned it and she sent it, and it's published here. So he was a writer. Meir Wunder is an author. In his book, The Gedolim of Galicia, mentions my father. So no wonder he sat down and wrote what was happening when he had time to do it. My father began to write on single pages of very bad quality. He used pencils, very sharp pencils in order to write very small script. Fortunately, he wrote down the names of the chapters on a single piece of paper, so we were able to reconstruct everything. And when he heard of the murder of a relative, he wrote an acrostic poem. The Kinner, the lament on his Rebbe, I saw it printed in 6 different Sforim. Lately a 7th came out. He had to be very careful. They didn't travel with luggage. I mean, they had bags, and he had to be very careful that these pages didn't get wet. Somehow he managed. He intended to become an author after the war. The diary consists of a total of some 80 pages written on both sides. My uncle David and my cousin Feivel Wolgeler must have taken this thing along with other luggage when they went away to look for another hiding place. I have a number of letters which also survived simply because they couldn't be sent. There was no postal service in conquered Poland. There is a little notebook with a short form of the diary and all the poems inside. We call this the Machberes. He addressed it to his older brother in Toronto, but he wasn't able to send it. My uncle David gave it to the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. They typed it and they sent the original to Uncle Avrom in Toronto. And many Holocaust researchers have come across that, like Rabbi Avrom Krieger of Shem Olam in Kfar Aroeh, Professor Jan Gross of Princeton University, and Dr. Leah Price of Yad Vashem. So people knew that my father had written a diary. People knew that. At the Shem Olam Institute, Rabbi Krieger scanned all the pages in high quality, with high quality professional equipment, so that it became much easier to read. I have to say that all the merits for bringing the diary to publication belong to my younger son Nafti. After getting the pages after my marriage in 1964, I quickly gave up trying to read them, and for the next 25 years it lay in a drawer. When my son turned 18, he started to read, and I made photocopies, enlarged photocopies for him. He worked on it for 10 years. He went to Toronto to my uncle David twice during holidays and worked with him to clear up all unfamiliar names, all unfamiliar events, so that it became, they typed everything onto a floppy disk at that time. So I had the whole thing, and I looked for someone who could translate it into English. After evaluating some linguists, I picked Rabbi Avrom Yaakov Finkel to translate the Yiddish and Hebrew text into English. Then I looked for a publisher. ArtScroll and Feldheim showed little interest. Holocaust literature wasn't selling well enough. And sometimes then, seeing that Holocaust survivors were dying, the Novominsker Rebbe made an appeal: keep the memory of the Holocaust alive. The English manuscript came to the attention of Rabbi Moshe Kaufman of Israel Bookshop Publications, that's this company, and Mrs. Hindi Mandel edited and worked over the thing for 6 years, and it was printed 3.5 years ago. Last summer, the Yiddish original was printed. This whole book has a kind of happy end, because 26 years ago we found the grave of my father and 7 other family members. This happened in the following manner. While working on the manuscript in 1993, my son Nafti attended a yearly reunion of Jaloshitze Jews in Israel. This was in order to learn more about the past, about the Jaloshitz, everything. My cousin Feivel Wolgeler advised him to get in touch with a former partisan Avrom Fuhrman in Ashdod. During their conversation, Fuhrman asked Nafti, "Were you ever at the grave of your grandfather?" Nafti said, "No." Fuhrman asked, "Why not?" Nafti answered, "Because no one knows where it is." Fuhrman said, "I know exactly where it is." So Nafti acted quickly and competently. He organized an expedition with experts, and just 1 month later we found the unmarked grave in a little forest near Dembowitz and transferred the 8 Kedoshim to Har HaMenuchos in Jerusalem. The story was published in many newspapers. I will give you a little collection of articles to see. As I said, in the unfinished diary, it serves as a kind of happy end. Some Jaloshitzer, some old Jaloshitzer, as well as Avrom Fuhrman, came to the Levaya. He was carrying a concealed gun, Avrom Fuhrman. I asked him, "Why do you do that?" He was afraid of Polish agents bent for revenge, because during his activity as a partisan in Poland around Jaloshitz, he had executed Polish peasants who had betrayed their Jewish refugees. After the liberation, okay, so he was afraid, he carried a gun. I don't think they would have found him here in Israel, but that's how it was. After the liberation, he had accompanied my mother, Uncle David, Feivel Wolgeler, and myself to the grave. That's why he knew exactly where it was. What is absolutely incomprehensible to me, I don't understand it, to this day not. Neither my mother nor Uncle David ever told me that they knew where the grave was. I can't understand it. However, I'm happy we found it. 2 months after finding the grave, on the 1st of Tammuz, we inaugurated a small monument on Har HaMenuchos Tamir, 49 years after they were murdered. And since then, I've been going there for the yard site almost every year. That's about it. Yes.
How did you describe those times?
When there was a minyan in the place I was at, or my mother made sure I was at such a place, when the Chazan reached the different place. When the Chazan came to the place where an orphan is supposed to say Kaddish, I said Kaddish, a little boy.
Okay. We have a special guest who's come all the way from San Diego, who's a relative of Feivel. That's Rabbi Jeff Wolgeler, who was in Poland recently, who's just going to mention, I know the time is late, but it really is an honor and a privilege to have you here this evening. And if you could just mention a few words about your trip to Poland and your connection. And we can pass this around.
So, I have nothing. I have nothing to add. This is the second time that I've had the schus to hear Feivel speak. I had the incredible schus to have him in my community. Somebody in my community is a theater director, and took the unfinished diary and turned it into a play. A reading, it turned it into a reading, and it was, I mean, I think it was appropriate and beautiful, something I was very worried about. You know, it's taken in the hands of a theater director, and just who knows what's going to happen with it. And it was something I think that was very, very moving, and it touched me very deeply. And it was a story I knew pieces of as, you know, growing up and hearing about the family. And I started taking trips to my shul of people to. We started going to Poland. We were there on Yom HaShoah, and then into Israel on Yom Ha'atzmaut. And last year we decided that we were going to try very hard to see if we could find the farm, if we could find the history. And I got in touch with Feivel very late, but he told me he didn't think that I was going to be able to find the farm, but for sure, Joliset's the town we'd be able to find. And we went, and really, I could speak long about how emotional and incredibly moving it was. I remember as a kid, there was a series on television called The Holocaust, and what was incredible about it was pretty bad, but what was incredible about it was that they took names and faces, and that it wasn't anymore. As a child, they always showed us Holocaust movies in school. They weren't afraid of that, and we were every year on Yom HaShoah. It was dramatic programs, and a lot of information was given to us, but never names and faces. It wasn't real. It was just the story. And I remember through this movie, it became real, and this to me was something it was incredible to be able to stand there knowing that this is where the family was from, that this was the history. It wasn't just the history of the Jewish people, but it was something that was really very personal, felt a very strong connection. We had a Polish guide, and the Polish guide said to me, I think I can find the farm. He had done research, literally the night before. He had spent all night long. He had done research on Polish sites, and he found all the information that he needed. We started driving through I don't know if I told you even this whole story, but we started driving through the back roads, and he says, a bus driver, he says, stop. He says, that's the farm. And I look at it, and I was looking at the pictures from the book, but the pictures were 25 years ago. There was a little addition that was made to it. And I'm looking at him saying, I'm not sure it's exactly the one. He says to me, no, this is it. We get out of the bus. It was a terribly rainy day. We get out of the bus. We're standing there, and I'm bursting, and all of a sudden, I can only imagine what this must have looked like. Here we are in, this fancy van with a bunch of Americans, and we're standing there, and I'm telling the story as I know it, and filling them in with some of the details, and then an older Polish fellow comes out of the next door, and he says, my guide goes over to him. And I didn't understand what he was saying. He was speaking in Polish, but he said something about Wolgeler to the guy. Do you know anything about this family that was hiding in this farm? And the guy says, yes. And he says, but this is what you want. And he marches me down the road to a field. And he says to me, go across the field. And then he walks away. And I don't know where I'm going, but I'm walking through this field. And I assume that was the place where they were buried, and you can still see some it looked like like a hole. I mean, there was a loch. I mean, it was a hole in the ground, and it was just an incredible thing to be able to stand there and to know that we still go on, the Jewish people still goes on, the family still goes on. And it was a flood of emotions. This part I don't think I told you, that when we came to Eretz Yisrael, I traveled with Balabatim, with people that were not religious, and we had to do a lot of teaching to make all of this meaningful. And we taught them Ani Mamin as we were going through, and it was really very beautiful. We have a connection with Rosh Yeshiva in Merkaz Arav. And we went there, wanted to show people a terrific kind of celebration of Yom Ha'atzmaut. And we sat with Rosh Yeshiva, he spoke with us, and after davening, they sing very beautifully, they sing Ani Mamin. And while we're singing on Imam, and a fellow walks over to me, taps me on the shoulder, and he says to me, "Are you Wolgeler?" And I said, "Yes." He says, "I'm the Rosh Hashiva's son-in-law. My name is Furman."
Furman.
Furman.
Yeah.
The Einikel.
Yeah.
From so Furman, and here we were, the two of us, with mishpachas. We're cousins. I mean, it's mishpachas. And we're standing there in a Beis Medrash, seeing on Imam, and it was just, the whole thing was just surreal. I can only tell you, if you have an experience, if you ever get a chance to go to Poland, and you read the diary, which is a difficult read, because it's painful, but it brings the whole experience really to life. And if you have an experience, to be able to stand there, to be able to go to Jelisets, to go to some of these places, and to feel some of that, it's really something incredible. And really the greatest memorial to Chaim Yitzchak and to all 6 million Jews is that Torah continues, and that Yiddishkeit continues, and the Jewish people continues on, is really an incredible thing. So I don't even know what I'm doing, why they asked me to say anything, but it's just to be around Feivel and to be able to have, a few times I've had an opportunity to speak with him. I can only imagine who his father was. It's really the kind of person that I've just caught a little glimpse of. I can only imagine what his father must have been.
Furman's son told me that his father, after that, we found that he never spoke of anything else than this until he died. His widow is still alive, I think.
So his father, when he found out that I have a relationship with the Rosh Hashiva, and he knew that I was going to be there. Yeah, so he told me.
Of the Rosh Hashiva.
Right, that's right. So he told me, he said to the son, "You have to go over to Wolgeler, and you have to tell him." Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay. I just want to thank you again all for coming this evening. I think to hear the story and to see in reality people who were involved, and it's remarkable, it's incredible. But really thank you all so much for coming. I want to call on a very close friend, Roy from Telford, who will give a vote of thanks.
It's an absolute zchut, a privilege and an honor as a resident of Yerushalayim for many years. Tonight has really touched my heart, and I'm sure everybody else standing up here. What a story, and the way you present it with such neshama, clarity. Nobody can dispute these facts. It's really amazing. Many years ago, soon after I came on Aliyah, I was a young gabbai in the Beit Knesset Gadol. And often there were different types of events that happened, but one particular event comes to my mind right now, when the late Dr. Yosef Burg was the guest of honor at one of these ceremonies, and actually the Beit Knesset, part of it was established in memory of the 6 million. And Dr. Burg came past me, and he mentioned to somebody, walked past the table, and he said to this gentleman, "I know you from Bergen-Belsen." And as a young adult then, it really touched my heart that somebody was standing right next to me who was there in those horrors, and a gentleman like Dr. Borg was helping those in the DP camps to get them out of there. And just these kind of stories really touch my heart. As Les knows, we've done a few of these events memorizing the Shoah. And just as closing a circle, Rav Wolgeler is the Rav of my brother's shul in San Diego, so that really closes a circle over here. So in a token of thanks, I just want to give you a gift of Yiddishkeit, of neshama, music. Enjoy.
Thank you.
And thank you very much. It's mamash zchut. Thank you very much.
just want to end off lastly to wish refuah shlema to your father, to Michal, real refuah shlema, and may this talk be in his zchut as well.
Can I say something to you? Because he gave a very good speech. There's something is